I totally forgot to start recording this session, so let me just make sure that I am recording this now. Just gonna jump off my screen here for a second. Am I recording? Yes, I'm recording now. Okay, let's go back into the time-lapse class. Okay, now we're recording. Okay, so yeah, like we said, set your frame count to 300. You want 3 seconds apart, which is a good general start point for capturing these images. Once you're ready with that, and you've gotten yourself running, you've got your first one there, that's when you can start expanding into the different ways that you want to shoot. Or if you're already comfortable with some of the basics, there's some rough ideas you want to work with in how to have your camera set up that will protect you from having things like flicker or super staccato imagery in the video, because there are some things you want to keep in mind. So if you're someone who likes to shoot in aperture or manual exposure, this can be a great way to work with time-lapse as well. So if you're using Aperture Priority for this first point, you're going to set the camera up, pick your aperture, and set your ISO so that you have a specific ISO to work with, and then allow your shutter speed to be the variable for the exposure there. And the reason for that is, so if we look at this video that'll play on the bottom while we're talking here, there's a couple different things that we're used to seeing when it comes to photography, right? Night longer exposure work where you've got a couple second long video or a couple second long exposure, you know that lights should become light trails. This way you're keeping your exposure down, you're minimizing the amount of noise in the picture, and it just looks more natural there. So when you're working with something like Aperture Priority, it allows you to let the shutter speed drag for the nighttime shots to get those beautiful long stretched out light trails. But then, as in this case, a night to day time lapse, as it starts to go through, that shutter speed starts to rise based on the exposure settings you gave it, and start to not cause those cars to blur out. It starts to let the clouds actually look more natural and move through the frame properly. And when you do it like that, where you're letting the camera do some of the work for you, it starts to just broaden what the image is providing to people. It allows people that are viewing this as a piece of content to scan it with their eyes and pick out parts that they like, that they enjoy. And utilizing that with your framing and your experience in photography in general will help you tell a different story that you may or may not be able to tell as a still image. But when you start looking at the shutter speeds, there are some things you want to be a little aware of. Since videography and cinematography are typically shot in one of 3 frame rates, depending on where it is and what your output is, you want to be careful of your shutter speeds. Most video, if you've gone to the movies, most movies are projected at 24 frames per second. Most television is broadcast, in the US at least, is broadcast at 30 frames per second. And a lot of YouTube content is actually now being shared in 60 frames per second. So with each of these, you want to be a little aware of what shutter speed you're going to want to use for that output. Because in the cinema world, in order for that end video to kind of look as natural as possible so that we as the viewer don't seem a little jarred by that content, we basically follow a simple shutter speed rule for that. So if you're shooting and you want to output this as 24 frames per second, you want to have your camera capturing at most a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second. If you're in 30p is your output, you want to record in 1/60th of a second is your maximum fastest shutter speed. And then if you're outputting in 60 frames per second, you don't want to go any higher than 120th of a second. Now, these numbers come from the cinema side of the industry, where the basic rule, like I said, is it's double whatever the frame rate you're recording at. So you just take whichever your output frame rate is and just double it. And that's the maximum shutter speed you should be at. Now, these are considered like rules, quote unquote, in the cinema world, but they can be bent. You're not going to get super detrimental results by going a little too fast or too slow. In fact, going slower for time-lapse photography actually gives a much nicer look, I think. But as you start going into this, you're very quickly going to find that in broad daylight, it's near impossible to keep those shutter speeds that slow. We're used to shooting out in the middle of the day with bright sun, clear skies. It's very easy to, even at 100 ISO, your camera's going to pick something like 500th of a second, 1,000th of a second, 8,000th of a second. So the number one tool you use to kind of get around that is using neutral density filters. So any kind of ND filter is going to be an amazing tool to add to your kit. There's a ton of different versions of these, and you will use them over and over and over again, especially in time-lapse photography. So getting the right one is kind of an important thing if you want to go down this path. There are two styles of ND filters. There's a fixed plate ND filter, which is it's a set number of stops that it cuts light. In my case, I typically use a 10 stop neutral density, which means it's cutting the light by 10 full exposure values or stops. So you'll go very quickly from 100th of a second to a couple seconds in your exposure based on utilizing an ND filter. Or you can go with something like a variable ND filter, which is really two polarizers that are opposing each other, that as you rotate them, it gets darker and darker. Either one is going to be a great option to work with depending on what it is you want to film or even just photograph. And as photographers, we may already have some of these. You may even already have a polarizer, which polarizer is a good thing to keep too. So as a way to keep yourself in having that shutter speed in the right area, getting yourself a good neutral density filter is going to be a big advantage in doing this. And the team at Picture Line has a ton of different options. You can definitely chat with them. Since I'm fairly biased in my preference on neutral density filters, because I really only work with one or two brands, working with the team there, they're going to be great at suggesting which one works best for you. And you'll see that they vary widely in price. You can go really high-end top tier, mid-tier, which is a great way to start. Even if you just want to get it and you don't want to really spend a lot of money in it, you know, getting a basic ND filter can definitely get you through. The biggest tip I would give, though, especially for time lapse, because you don't want to have major color shifting as you're shooting through this long group of images, is whatever ND filter you get or whatever filter you get, make sure you white balance all of your imagery with the filter on. So if your camera can take one, make sure you white balance after you put the neutral density filter on. They're supposed to be neutral, but in most cases they have some sort of color cast to them. So you will get a little bit of a shift. So just keep an eye out on that. And again, the team at Picture Line can help you with that kind of stuff too. So now that you've got kind of the exposure system and the idea of how you want to expose these images down, you want to start working on, well, what is the aspect ratio you want to record this in? Where do you want to deliver this content? Now, traditionally, we output video in a 16:9 aspect ratio. So all of our televisions, not really so much movies anymore. Well, not really movies ever. 16:9 is the standard full HD or 4K presentation aspect ratio that you would use so that when you play this on a television, it fills the entire screen. So depending on the camera, you can typically set your aspect ratio to 16:9 in camera and have that embedded in all of the JPEGs that you're going to capture. So it takes a little bit of guesswork out of that. But there are certain circumstances where you may want to capture the full image area that your camera can offer. So if you're in full frame, it's a 3:2 aspect ratio. If you're in our micro four thirds cameras, it's a 4:3 aspect ratio. And if you have a 1-inch camera, a 1-inch censored camera, those are typically in a 3:2 aspect ratio as well. So by recording with the full image area, so maximizing the resolution you have, it gives you a couple options for your time lapse after you've shot it. And by that, I mean, it gives you the ability to shift the frame up and down, crop into it a little bit, change the framing a bit. So if you've got the camera all set up and you shot it in the full aspect ratio and you realize that there's something super distracting in the bottom, once you crop it to 16:9, you'll see that you have the ability to shift that frame up and have it balance that overall look out and keep distracting items out of your frame. But something more modern these days is obviously delivering on Instagram. Instagram being where, at least in my case, I deliver most of my time lapse videos on the Instagram platform. There's a couple differences when it comes to aspect ratio that Instagram allows. Now, you can load a 16:9 aspect ratio image or video into Instagram and it'll take it, but it will crop the top and bottom, or it'll give you a bunch of white space top and bottom that becomes unusable. So your video starts to get smaller and smaller. If you want to maximize the amount of resolution that you're displaying on Instagram, they use a 5:4 or 4:5 aspect ratio, depending if you're in portrait or landscape. So by shooting in that full image area mode in your camera, you have the ability to then, with software, crop out 5:4 or 4:5, just like you would with a still image, so that you maximize the visible information in a delivery location, whether it's YouTube, Vimeo, Facebook, Instagram, whatever. And like we said, at least with our cameras, you have the option to set most of these resolutions. The only one you can't set is 5:4 so far. I don't think anyone's actually set that as a crop in camera yet, outside of frame lines in our S1H series camera. So once you know where you want this delivered and you have an idea of what aspect ratio you're going to have your camera set up, now comes the choice of, do you record RAW or JPEG? Or do you record both? This is going to come down to your level of wanting to work on these files, right? So if you're doing JPEGs, it's the same principle that we follow in photography. JPEGs are easy, they're simple, they're typically baked in color, so the look that you create in your camera, that's how the image is going to come out. It's easy to share a JPEG, and ultimately, no matter what, a JPEG is what you have to convert a RAW file into anyway for delivery. So if you're confident in your exposure control in creating a singular image, shoot JPEG. It's a great way to get into it, minimize the amount of storage space you need, and just speed up your process overall. But if you're shooting something that's more of a challenging lighting situation, so I'll use that night to day time lapse as a great example of it. You may want to start tweaking that exposure a little bit over time to kind of balance out any kind of flicker, or you may want to adjust the image in general so that there's maybe a little more vibrance, or you want to bring up the shadow detail. Shooting in RAW gives you that ability still, just like you do as a normal regular image that you're going to capture, but now you're just doing it across 300, 1,000, 5,000 images, and trying to keep it as the same exposure across the board. So RAW can be a big advantage for this. I do shoot RAW for a lot of my time lapse as a backup. So if I do want to do some cropping, if I want to make sure, like say white balance gets completely screwed up because a cloud comes over while you're shooting, RAW is that nice safety net for you in time lapse, same as it is in standard photography. Then it comes to file size. Depending on the camera you're working with, you may know that your camera has a ton of resolution. It may be the reason you bought the camera. My go-to time-lapse photography camera right now is the S1R. And that's a 47 megapixel camera. So that's a ton of information that I have to work with for every type of photography I want to use. But what you want to keep in the back of your mind is that video is nowhere near the same resolution that our stills imagery is. Full high definition video, so 1920 by 1080p video, is only 2 megapixels. So very, very small. 4K is only 8 megapixels. So keeping that in mind, you'll realize very easily that pretty much any camera you have, and this is the reason why we have time lapse in all of our cameras, any camera you have with almost any resolution is more than enough to create stunning looking video, even if your camera can't record 4K or, well, actually, I don't really know many cameras that don't record 4K these days. But if say you want to do a 4K 60 frame per second video, your camera can do 4K, you can record and do a time lapse out at 60 frame per second because you know that you still have more than enough resolution. And for those that have ultra high resolution cameras like the S1R, you can also theoretically output an 8K time lapse if you wanted to as well. Now, 8K is obviously, most people don't have 8K displays in their homes. It's still a very early world for 8K video. But if you're someone who likes to create an image so that you know you have longevity with it, whether it's a photograph or a video, mastering that file, so making the first one as that ultra high resolution one and then just down sampling it to 1080 to 4K 720 ends up meaning that as technology changes, that time lapse you create will still be looking beautiful on newer displays as they come out. The kind of last thing you want to make sure you're aware of when it comes to the actual setup for the camera is your battery life. When you look at the way cameras are rated for battery life, you'll see a couple of trends there. Traditional DSLRs were somewhere around, I think, like 16 to 1700 pictures per battery, where mirrorless cameras tend to be around anywhere from 400 to around 600 shots per battery, according to a company called SEPA, or a group called SEPA. When you're working with time-lapse photography, it's not uncommon to have 300, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 images for a single clip. But what ends up happening is looking at those SEPA numbers, you may think you're going to run through battery infinitely, like tons of batteries just for one time lapse. So there's a couple options you have here, and there's a couple things to be aware of as well with it, is that those ratings that are given for camera battery life expectancy, especially in mirrorless cameras, those are based on how DSLRs were tested, which meant you always counted shutter actuations to determine roughly how long your battery is going to last. Mirrorless cameras are a little different. Mirrorless cameras, for the most part, if you can get 10,000 pictures in a 2.5 hour period, or however long cameras typically are rated for video use, then you're going to get a much higher number than what that SEPA rating is for your camera. But ultimately, relying on just the camera's battery is not one of the smarter options for this. Most cameras and most camera brands, you can buy AC adapters so that you can be plugged into a wall and have uninterrupted power. This takes that entire guessing of, well, how many pictures can my camera take? Totally out of the equation there. These kinds of options typically will replace the battery in the camera and then require you to plug into a wall, a physical wall outlet, and will just continuously run. And that's great if you're working at home, if you're working at a location where you know you have access to wall power. But if you're out hiking, if you're traveling, and you know you're not going to have that access, some cameras still also offer the capabilities to power deliver and charge over USB. So a camera like our S1, I can take a simple USB battery bank that I would use for a cell phone that has, I think it's a minimum of 5 volt 2 amp or 1.5 amp. So like the nicer USB battery chargers. And I can plug that into the camera's USB port, and it will also do the same thing that plugging it into the wall would. It will charge the battery in the camera. It will let me run off that external power source for hours longer than any of the in-camera batteries can. So that means if I'm out hiking, I can set my camera up, set my tripod up, plug in my power supply, get it into the camera, and know that I've got more than enough power for the time lapse that I want to capture. And that's important because one of the worst feelings you'll get as you start going further and further down this path of time lapse is you've got everything set up, you're waiting for that perfect sunrise, the conditions are great. You go, you set the camera up, and you realize that halfway through the battery died. And that entire time-lapse shot is gone and the entire event's missed. And it's one of the more frustrating things to have happen. By knowing that you've got that reserve battery supply or that capability in your camera, it will take that stress out of the shooting. And again, less stress, less complexity, less variables to go wrong, the more you're going to enjoy doing this and the more likely you are to expand into the next level of time-lapse photography. So with time-lapse photography, now it also comes to lens selection. Just like every other type of photography, what lenses work best and which lenses do you use to get your vision across? Excuse me, I had to take a drink of water there. So just like standard photography, there are good lenses to use, recommended lenses to use, lenses that you probably shouldn't use. But ultimately, it comes down to what you're trying to film, what you're trying to convey. If you're someone who loves super shallow depth of field and you want to do a time lapse of, say, a sunflower in a field, following the sun throughout the day, you can do that and work with something like a 50 millimeter and shoot it 2.8 aperture so you have that beautiful blown out background. It's totally doable. More challenging, but it's doable. But ultimately, what a lot of people tend to do with time lapse is usually you're using these in kind of larger expanses, larger landscape types of images. So for something like that, going with a wide angle lens, something like a 16-35 on a full frame camera, or if you're in the micro four thirds realm, something like our 8-18 become amazing choices for this. And you have two reasons for that. One is that wide angle is great for landscape, clearly. And it typically ends up being a smaller, lighter lens, at least in our systems. So you're not having to worry about large, heavy lenses. And two, typically, ultra wide angle lenses aren't able to be filtered. So we go back to working with that neutral density filter to keep your shutter speeds down. Looking at certain wide angle lenses, you'll see like our 16-35 f4, our 8-18 2.8 to f4. They're designed specifically so that I can still throw a filter on this lens and not have to worry about it. So when you're going with wide angle, that's one of the things to just be aware of is can you filter that lens easily, or are you going to have to get some sort of system that allows you to put compression rings on to attach a filter. But wide angle lenses tend to be the easiest ones to work with because obviously, like I said, they're ultra wide. You can typically filter some of them, but most importantly, your depth of field is inherently much deeper than a wide angle lens or than a more standard normal or telephoto lens. So that means setting your focus, working at something like f8, f11, you know that you're going to have more than enough depth of field for what you're trying to photograph, and you know you're not going to have issues of just defocused areas where you may not have wanted them. Now, a caveat to when you're looking at lenses and you're working and getting this thing set up is you want to make sure that you're not using autofocus. So you want to turn autofocus off for time lapse. And the reason for that is in time-lapse photography, any slight change to the image or the camera position becomes incredibly jarring in the final video. What I mean by that is if I have, we'll go back to the tripod, if I have a simple tripod that's not really spec'd to carry the weight of my camera and the wind blows and the tripod shakes, well, when you look at that video that's produced after this, you're going to see major skipping in the video that you create because every frame is on screen for longer than a traditional video. So making sure that you've got something that is super stable is important. That equally ties to your focus. If you leave your autofocus on and you're doing like that first video I showed in downtown Austin, as people are walking in front of the camera because it's set up, and should I have had autofocus on, the camera's going to refocus every single image. And what that will do is certain images will have more out of focus background, more out of focus foreground. The focus is going to jump around as people move in and out. It may not find focus if for some reason the camera goes to take the picture, refocus, and the subject changes. It ends up putting in a ton of variables that are totally unpredictable in how it's going to look in your end result. So taking focus totally out of the equation makes it to where, again, you're not having to worry about that change. You're telling the camera what you want it to focus on, and you're controlling the narrative. And even in full automatic for that first time lapse that you create, you'll see that if you play around with it in autofocus and just point it at a window or something like that, you'll see that the camera will randomly start to try to adjust focus because after a while it's going to keep every single image refocusing. That's just how the camera works because you're just capturing single pictures over and over again. Once you flip it to manual focus, you notice that all of that goes away. So make sure you've got a lens that you can put into manual focus, whether it's on the body or in the physical lens itself, like our S-series lenses. The S Pro line has a collar that you can pull back and actually manual focus, and know that you're not going to have that jump around. So now that you've got your focus set up, the camera ready to go, how do you pick your intervals? You know that you want to take 300 pictures, but you're not sure at what interval should I capture these images at to portray motion. A general guideline is if you're photographing something that has moving traffic, good moving traffic, fast moving clouds, if you're setting the camera up in a car and you want to have it trace your journey, as long as you're not touching it, being anywhere close to it, or being otherwise distracted by it. Driving is an option for time-lapse as well. You roughly want to set your interval to be anywhere from like 1 to 3 or 4 seconds. This is because the interval between every photo will have enough information change and enough new information come into frame so that you end up not just getting these lulls in the video where nothing's really changing, or it's a tiny little change every single image. It adds more drama to the content, and it adds more sense of motion and a higher level of production as you're picking that interval. But if you're doing something like a sunset or a sunrise, or it's kind of a lazy afternoon and the clouds are moving slow, or you're photographing a city street and people are kind of strolling through, that's when you can start picking longer intervals. And the reason there, again, is because just like with fast moving things, the opposite is true for this. You need more time between each of those frames to convey motion. People walking isn't really fast unless you're watching like a track meet or someone's running or jogging. Depending on the activity, you want to kind of judge which you should go. If it's slow moving activities, lengthen your interval. If it's fast moving activities, shorten your interval. And as you look at this, you'll see this is the base equation that we use in our heads or on paper to figure out how many frames should I take for a general video. So our example here is I want a 10-second video, and I'm going to play it back at 24 frames per second, which means roughly I'm going to need 240 frames. When I set these at a 5-second interval for the project, how long am I going to have the camera sitting here? And the way you figure that out is you take that interval that you're going to be shooting and you multiply that by the number of frames. And what that's going to give you is the total amount of time in seconds that those 240 frames are going to take to be created. Once you get that number, then you divide it by 60 seconds so that you can get minutes. And then they'll tell you that if I wanted to do a 10-second video at 24 frames per second output with a 5-second interval, it's going to take me 20 minutes to actually capture all of those frames. So depending on how long of a video you want to create or what your interval is, you can use this simple math to kind of figure out and plan how much time am I going to have to devote having my camera set here. Or you can work the other way and say, I have a 2-hour long event and I want to have a 1-minute long video. You can work the math backwards to get yourself to find out, well, what interval does it need to be at, and what interval do I want to have it at? How many pictures am I going to need? And again, this was based off 24 frames per second. You can do 30 frames per second, just change the 24 to 30 or to 60. So once you're ready, you have a couple options depending on the camera that you're using. Some cameras will have time-lapse functionality built in, like we said. Some cameras don't. Cameras that don't, you can pick up these plug-in intervalometers. Typically, they will plug into the remote shutter port on whichever camera you're using. And what they do is they take all of this information, so your number of pictures, the intervals that you want to shoot them at, and it lets you plug that in, and then the remote handles sending the signal to the camera within that period to trigger the camera. If you're using a LUMIX camera, we have all of this information built in right into all of our cameras. So in the middle here, I have our S1 or S series menu displayed up because it's the most feature-rich of our cameras for time-lapse. So what you can see here is that you'll have time-lapse or animation, because our cameras can also do stop-motion animation because it's a very similar technique to time-lapse. But for this case, I have it set up in the time-lapse mode here. The first option down is your shooting interval setting. Now, what this is in the full-frame cameras in the S series, this is where you can tell the camera that, well, after you shoot this sequence, start another sequence and just keep going until I tell the camera to stop. So most of the time I have this on. The next one down is start time. So as long as you have the camera set up properly for its time, so you have the clock set properly, this gives you two ways to actually start your time lapse. You can either have it start now, which is literally just push the shutter button, it starts the image sequence capture, and it just goes until it's done. Or you can program in a time that you want the camera to actually start capturing. Now, this is great for if you want to do sunrise time lapse, because not everybody wants to wake up super early in the morning to be up before the sun comes up, set up the camera, do everything there, have your cup of coffee while you're doing this, and it ends up just taking a lot of time. So what you can do is, if you know the framing you want, and it's typically easier to frame during the day, you have your framing all set up, you know where you want your camera positioned, you program in the image count and the intervals and everything that you have set. You can then just tell the camera, hey, wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and run this and start taking the pictures. And the camera will do it. It will start taking the pictures at the time that you tell it to. The next setup down here is image count and shooting interval. So this is where you plug in the information of how many pictures do you want to take and at what interval do you want those pictures taken. Now, this is the part that's going to vary a lot depending on how long of an output video you want, how long of an event duration you have. So this is where that core information goes in. Now, in our cameras, again, as long as you have the internal clock set properly, at the bottom, it will tell you when the time lapse is going to end based on that information you put in. So if you know that you want to be able to shoot until 6 o'clock in the morning and it's about 9 o'clock at night, and you know that you have or that you want a 5-second interval in the frames, you can, while you're doing this, start upping the image count if you don't want to do the math for it, and just look on the bottom of the camera and you'll see that it will start to change the time when it's going to end with which day. And the last setting here is something that's currently exclusive to the S series cameras. I don't know if this is something that the other cameras can do yet. And this is called exposure leveling. Now what this does, if you're shooting in something like Aperture Priority, or I believe Shutter Priority, so it has to be one of the actual Aperture Shutter Priority modes, what this will do is it takes the exposure information and it levels the exposure out across all of the images that you capture when you're exporting the video. Now, a challenge with modern digital cameras with time-lapse photography is that our aperture blades are controlled electronically, and this is true for every camera. And as you're shooting still images one after another, over and over and over and over and over again, it's very easy to detect a slight shift in exposure between every single image. And it's more likely to happen with time-lapse photography because digital cameras, modern lenses, though they're electronically controlled and they're very high in precision for build and how they're controlled, an aperture blade may not stop down to the 100% identical same spot every single time. And that's where you get flicker in your time-lapse images, is when the exposure is slightly imbalanced across the next image or the following sequence. So by turning exposure leveling on, this helps mitigate that issue of flicker and kind of level the whole image out across all of the images. Later on, in the next couple of slides, I'll show you there's also a software way to do this, which is what's called exposure ramping, or using some of the software to actually kind of intelligently pick images before and after it to balance the exposures there. The next kind of main thing that you want to have set up before you actually go and you start shooting is, in my opinion, this app called Photopills. Excuse me. So this app, Photopills, is an incredibly useful tool for not just time-lapse photography, but also for astrophotography, for portrait photography, figuring out what lens you should use, the field of view you want to shoot at, hyperfocal distances, pretty much you name it, it's got it in there. So for this purpose, I'm using it for a time-lapse calculator. So what I can do here is on the left part of the screen grab there of my phone, you'll see that it has a clip duration tile. So what you would do is you tap on that, punch in the how long of a clip you want to have for a video in the end. In this case, I put 3 minutes. The next tile over is the event duration. So say I want to do that the entire sunrise, and I know that I want to record for about 4 hours, or in this case, I have it set up for 7.5 hours. What I do there is I plug in 7 hours, 30 minutes, and then click set. And what it already starts to do, once it has those two criteria, is it already starts to calculate out, well, how many photos should you take, and at what interval should you have them at? The next one over is frame rate. So this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is what frame rate do you want to have these images played out at? Do you want it 24 frame per second, 30 frame per second, or 60 frame per second? In my case, I put 24 frame. I put the actual filming 24 frame per second, which is 23.98, because I happen to be working in a video file as well. But what this will do is this also, again, it adds more of that information to refine the number of photos and what the interval needs to be. Now, one of the nicest things about this app is that you have this last tile here, which looks like a memory card. And what this does is this lets you plug in a known value for what the size of the file that you're going to capture is. So if I know that my camera's JPEGs are 15 megabytes in size, and I put that piece of information here, that will tell me how much storage space am I going to use for this time lapse. So making sure that you're prepared and you're ready to go with the right size memory card, enough open storage on the memory card, is also an important part of the setup aspect to this. So utilizing an app like Photopills will be a big help in getting yourself set up so that you don't get into the middle of a time lapse and either run out of card space or set the interval wrong. This ends up being a really, really powerful tool to have in your pocket. It is available for iOS and Android, and I think it's a $10 app. But if you look at what it can do, it's a powerhouse of information to have with you. So now that we've covered all of that stuff, let's just recap to that first part, keeping it simple. You have all of that information about what to look for, what to kind of know how to set your camera up. This is why it becomes so important to just, for that first one you create, keep it simple. Auto exposure, keep it on a tripod. You can either set your aspect ratio to 16:9 or do it later if you're more comfortable there, and do something simple as a 10-second time-lapse video shooting 240 frames at a 3-second interval. This gets you a known good set of values to plug in, so that the first one you do, you're going to get a video, that the core information is going to be there, and then you can expand into those other settings of aperture, shutter priority, manual, whatever works best for you there. That is a duplicate slide of what we had before. So if you have a LUMIX camera and you've gone through the time lapse utilizing what the camera does internally, you have a leg up over other time lapse photographers here. And with that, it's that once the time lapse has been finished, so the image sequence is done, the camera is going to prompt you, do you want to create a video now? What we can do in the camera is actually take those still files that you created, and the camera will compile them, put them into a video file, and give you an MP4 video file that you can then just load onto your computer. If it's a 1080p video, you can share it to your mobile device. It makes the whole process super simple and straightforward. So once you click yes on Create Video Now, you're given a couple of options. This is where you can say, well, what record quality do I want the video to be in? Do I want 4K? Do I want 1080? Do I want 720 in some cameras? So once you pick out which frame rate you want, so this is that whole part of if you knew that you wanted a 24 frame per second video, you can go in here and just select 24 frame per second in 1080 or 4K. You can select a different frame rate for the playback. Now, typically for the first one, stick to 24 frame per second. as you start playing with the other frame rate options here, you'll see that you can lengthen or shorten the video. And then you have the ability to change the playback sequence. Do you want it to play forward in time or backwards in time? You can get some really cool effects by playing a time lapse backwards. Once you've set that information in and just tap OK, the camera's going to prompt you and say like, hey, it's going to take 4 minutes to create this video. Do you want to proceed? Once you click yes, the camera does its thing and then saves out the video for you. And one thing to note is with this process, it does not remove the images that you captured. It doesn't alter them at all. It just uses them, saves a video file, and puts it next in line in the files. So you don't, it's totally non-destructive. You're not losing anything by doing it in camera. But say you want to actually work with these on your computer instead of letting the camera do it. There's a ton of software out there available for time-lapse photographers. Some standalone programs, but a lot of them are going to be plugins. And you're going to use programs like Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever you're comfortable with, to resize these images, to crop them for 16:9, downscale them to 1920 by 1080 or 3840 by 2160 if you're doing 4K. This is where your actual exposure side comes in. So if you know that you want to start playing around with the exposures. Currently, the software that I use for my time-lapse photography is from Time-Lapse Plus. They're a relatively local company. I think they're a US-based company. That creates a plugin for Lightroom that guides you through how to blend your exposures and make sure that you're not getting any of those flicker in the videos that you create. So this is a really good, useful software that I use for time lapse. And then once you've got these videos, how do you share them? We're used to sharing photographs, which are only a couple of megs each, and you can text them, you can email them, you can Facebook message them. It's relatively easy to share a singular file. But time-lapse photography and videos are much, much larger. It's just like sharing a full-blown video. So utilizing platforms like YouTube or Vimeo become your best friend here. Load it up, get yourself a shareable link, and then you can send it off to your subscribers, your friends, family, whoever wants to see the video, your clients. Makes it super easy to share, and the content can be loaded, like I said, up to 8K now. So YouTube can support 8K video, though no one can really view it. So you have the ability to upload these ultra high resolution time-lapse videos in a platform that can dynamically change to the device that people are viewing it on. So highly recommend utilizing either YouTube or Vimeo for this. And then some little takeaways here. You can always expand further once you've gotten your first couple of time lapses down into using things like motorized sliders, rotating bases. These will all add more dynamic approaches to your content. It will add different layers of complexity if you're panning, following a cityscape, following a ship in a harbor, whatever you want to do there. It just goes to that next level. But having the core information of how the camera works is going to be crucial to be able to go to this next step and not get frustrated or not have something that just looks super wonky. You can always expand into what's called hyperlapse. Hyperlapse is a very similar technique to time-lapse, though instead of having the camera on a stationary tripod with the world moving around you, a hyperlapse is you moving through the world in time-lapse. If you search hyperlapse on YouTube, you will see a ton of beautiful examples of this. There is an amazing one through the streets of Morocco that was shot on the GH5 or GH4 or GH5 years ago, and it is breathtaking to watch, and it's a bit of a mind trip too. And then you can expand into different hardware for exposure ramping done in camera, so you minimize the amount of time you're spending on a computer to fix flicker. There's a ton of tools out there. That Time-Lapse Plus is a company that works with it. I know there's a ton of other brands that make them. I don't really have a particular preference in any of them, but it's that next step as you go. And then obviously for those that are just ready and want to jump into something like Premiere, Premiere makes it super easy to create time-lapse. All you do is once you open up a project, you import files like you would import any kind of normal video. Highlight the first of your still images in a folder. And it's crucial at this point to make sure that every single one of your images is renamed to a sequential name, so there's no breaks in the file naming. Highlight the first one, check that image sequence button there, and then just click open. Once you do that, Premiere automatically loads these into a video file that you can then manipulate to change what frame rate it's playing back at. And your time-lapse video is done at that point. You can do some editing to it, throw a soundtrack on it, which is what I typically do, and export it out, and it's just that one more step up from doing it in camera. And with that, that's the presentation part of it. I've seen a number of notifications come up here, so I'm going to stop share this. Let's see, have a couple questions here in the side. Will the PowerPoint be made available? Is there a chance of getting a copy of it? Thanks. So we can make the this entire recording will be made available. So we have to find a way to get that to everybody because the Zoom meetings will automatically record the sessions here. I will coordinate with the team at Pictureline. So what you'd want to do is definitely if you're interested in it, you want a copy of it, make sure to reach out to the team at Pictureline. The comment that they put in here about the 10% off and the orders at Pictureline, reach out to them, make sure, let them know that you want it, and they'll get you the link for this video. With that, does anybody have any other questions? I think at this point, if you would like to take your microphone off mute and ask a question, you are more than welcome to do that. I'll basically hang around for probably another 5-10 minutes if you guys want. Otherwise, like I said, I want to thank you guys for taking the time listening to me talk about time-lapse. It's a super fun thing for me. And hopefully you guys learn something and have something new that you can play around with while we've got all this extra time on our hands. Huge shout out again to the team at Pictureline for letting us do this. It's an awesome experience, and definitely take advantage of that 10% off. You needed batteries, new lens or something like that, or whatever you needed. You reach out to them. The team is great there and super helpful. So yeah. Otherwise, that's pretty much it. I'm going to put my contact information back up. So if anybody wants it, there you go. I should be sharing that screen again now. Yeah. See, Jared, I've seen a music video from that is cool. Yeah, thank you guys. Not a problem, iPhone. All right. How about a water drop capture course? That could be interesting. I can do some experimenting, see how I can actually do that. Because I am actually using our S1 as my webcam here through a little capture device thing from Elgato. So I can probably figure a way to do that. If you guys have requests for classes that you guys want, definitely make sure the team at Pictureline here, either however they want to be reached out to, we're open to doing tons of these classes, especially even after things get back to normal, because this is a fun way to reach out to everybody. Time we got here 3:10. All right, out of future session for dynamic lightning time lapse, sunrise and sunset. Yeah, I can definitely look and see about doing some of that. Some of those classes may be a little more challenging to do in this particular platform, Jeff, but I'm definitely open to looking and seeing what we can do. I've been working on actually doing an astro time lapse class, how to mix astro, Milky Way photography in with time lapse and show people how that's done. As I get closer to getting that class actually ready to present, I'm sure we'll be working with the team at Pictureline to offer that out to everybody. Is this how people capture multiple lightning strikes in time lapse? Jeff, do you mean when people have like a single image that has a ton of lightning strikes in it? Yeah. So you can do it like this. Typically, what that is, where you have multiple lightning strikes, that's usually one image. It's a bunch of images from the same area that's then just layered in Photoshop. So it's a composite image instead of a time lapse, but it's the same principle. You could take the images you get from the time lapse video, load them into Lightroom, and then just stack them using, I haven't done that in a very long time, but there's a couple blending methods where it only lets the newest, brightest information through. So that's how that's done. No problem. All right. And with that, I think we will call this now. Like I said, thank you everyone for spending the time and some of the great questions you had here and ideas for future classes. Be sure to reach out to Pictureline if you guys are interested in picking up some LUMIX equipment with that extra 10% off. That's pretty sweet deal right now. Just remember, it's orders at pictureline.com. And yeah, you do I do it a bit, Jared. Yeah. But yeah, all right, cool. Thanks everybody. I hope you guys all stay safe, practice social distancing responsibly, and don't let this time having to be away from everybody be a hindrance on your creativity. Take care, everybody.